This is the Summit Venture. We've just struck the Skyway Bridge. The bridge is down. Stop the traffic on that Skyway Bridge. Get emergency over here.
That frantic, bone-chilling transmission X-rayed through a blinding wall of gray at 7:34 a.m. A 600-foot steel leviathan, crippled by a sudden hurricane-force microburst, charging blindly into a concrete titan. On the bridge deck above, commuters drove into a void, their world vanishing as the steel buckled like paper. This wasn't just a maritime accident. It was a violent collision of nature's fury and human frailty. Was this a tragic twist of fate, or a failure we were destined to repeat? Today I invite you to stay with me until the very end, as we navigate through the wreckage to uncover the chilling truth behind the Sunshine Skyway, and a modern-day echo that proves some ghosts never truly rest. Trust me, the final revelation is one you cannot afford to miss. My dear friends, long before the steel and concrete skeletons of the Sunshine Skyway dominated the horizon, the passage across the lower Tampa Bay was a slow, rhythmic journey defined by the Beeline ferry service. Starting in the late 1920s, this two-ship ferry was the pulse of the region, carrying travelers between the city of St. Petersburg and the small community of Terratsea. It was a time of leisure and romance, where the crossing was not merely a commute but a coastal getaway, remembered fondly by locals for its sun-drenched decks and the salty breeze of the Gulf. However, as the 1950s approached, the world began to move faster. Florida was booming, commerce was surging, and the nostalgic, slow-moving ferry service was no longer a symbol of charm. It had become a bottleneck, a relic of a past that could no longer sustain the weight of a rapidly growing Florida economy. The region demanded a permanent artery, a colossal bridge that could defy the tides and unite the coastlines forever. The answer to this demand was the original Sunshine Skyway Bridge, a massive undertaking that opened in September 1954 to thunderous fanfare and a sense of national pride. Constructed at a cost of $22 million, a staggering sum for the era. It was a 2-lane, 4.5-mile-long engineering marvel that promised to change the face of the South forever. But the bridge was more than just the iconic cantilever span that photographers love to capture. It was a 15-mile logistical odyssey. To build this giant, engineers had to construct an entire network of roads and infrastructure leading up to the intercoastal waterways. Technically, 11 miles of the project were built directly over water, bridging multiple smaller channels in a daring display of human ingenuity. Yet from its very inception, the project was shrouded in a veil of controversy. The decision to place such a massive, rigid structure directly across the throat of Florida's most crucial shipping lane, the entrance to the Tampa Bay ship channel, was seen by many as a dangerous gamble. Planners were essentially daring the giants of the sea to navigate a needle's eye, placing sunken, reinforced concrete piers in the direct path of frequented maritime traffic. It was a masterpiece of design, but it was also a gauntlet thrown down in the face of nature. The bridge itself was a complex assembly of specialized structures, each designed for a specific purpose, but all contributing to a sense of architectural intimidation. There was Structure A, a double-leaf bascule or drawbridge span near Cow and Calf Key, designed to allow smaller vessels to pass with ease. Then came Structure B, a steel span rising 17.5 feet for small boat passage, followed by the truss spans of structures D and E. But the true heart of the project, and the eventual site of a nightmare, was structure C. This was the main section, a through-truss cantilever span 864 feet in length, soaring majestically over the water. To reach this height, motorists had to navigate steel truss approaches built at a 5% gradient. On a blueprint, 5% sounds like a minor inclination, but in the driver's seat of a 1950s sedan, it felt like an ascent into the heavens. The Skyway didn't just cross the bay, it loomed over it. The roadway was paved with a steel-grated metal deck, a see-through mesh that allowed drivers to look straight down through the floor of their vehicles at the churning white-capped waters 150 feet below. It was a narrow, terrifying, and awe-inspiring experience that left motorists white-knuckled and breathless. Beyond the steep 5% gradients and the chilling view through the steel-grated deck, a deeper, more structural danger lurked. The Sunshine Skyway was a non-redundant cantilever design. In the unforgiving logic of engineering, this meant the bridge had no safety net. It was a chain where every link was critical. There was no structural backup, no secondary path for the immense loads to travel if a single primary pier or support failed. It was a masterpiece of efficiency, yet a gamble of absolute fragility. The moment a vessel struck a vital support, the laws of physics would demand a total catastrophic collapse. As the years rolled into the 1960s and 70s, the bridge's popularity became its own burden. The single two-lane span was being suffocated by the very progress it had helped create. By 1971, the state was forced to expand, constructing a second identical bridge right alongside the original. This new twin, running perfectly parallel to the first, split the traffic. The west side carried southbound travelers, while the east side handled the northbound flow. For over 15 years, the original Skyway had stood as a lone sentinel, a singular silver ribbon against the blue of the bay. Now, it had a brother. This dual bridge configuration became the defining image of Tampa Bay, immortalized in countless postcards and family photographs. It was a symbol of a Florida that was doubling down on its future, a testament to the belief that humans could build their way out of any problem. But in the cold, hard logic of maritime navigation, doubling the bridge didn't just double the capacity, it doubled the target. Two massive steel skeletons now stood guard over a ship channel that was only 400 feet wide at its navigable center. It was a 400-foot gap through which massive bulk carriers laden with thousands of tons of cargo had to thread their way with surgical precision. Launched in 1976 by the Oshima Shipbuilding Company in Nagasaki, Japan, the Summit venture was a giant of modern commerce. Owned by Hercules carriers and flying the Liberian flag, she was a massive bulk carrier, stretching 609 feet in length with a beam of 85 feet. Her deadweight capacity exceeded 33,912 tons. A colossal weight distributed across sunken holds designed to carry dry goods like grains, coal, and cement across the world's oceans. By May 1980, the Summit venture was a well-traveled veteran of the sea, manned by an experienced crew of Chinese and Taiwanese descent who had navigated the Panama Canal and the treacherous routes of the Far East. However, the Summit venture was entering a bay already haunted by the ghosts of maritime failure, The early months of 1980 had been a dark omen for the Sunshine Skyway. On January 28th, just months before, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn collided with the tanker Capricorn in these very waters, resulting in the tragic loss of 23 servicemen. The ink on those casualty reports was barely dry when, on February 5th, the 600-foot Thalassini Mana struck the southbound span of the bridge. 11 days later, the 700-foot Joanna Feveth slammed into another pier, knocking massive chunks of concrete into the sea. The bridge was surviving, but it was being bruised, battered by a series of navigational errors that signaled a growing crisis. These were not just accidents. They were warnings that the margin for error in the 400-foot-wide channel was vanishing. And on the morning of Friday, May 9th, 1980, as the Summit Venture waited at the offshore anchorage to pick up a load of phosphate for Korea, the stage was set for the final, fatal act. At the center of this gathering storm stood one man, John Laro. He was not a man of negligence. He was a pilot of immense dedication and skill. Stationed at the pilot house on Egmont Key, Laro was a highly experienced mariner, a man whose life was defined by the nuances of the water, the tidal shifts, and the subtle language of navigational aids. When he stepped aboard the Summit Venture at 6:20 a.m. that morning, accompanied by pilot in training Bruce R. Atkins, he brought with him a reputation for meticulousness. Laro wasn't just a technician, he was a guardian of the bay. He had spent his career mastering this specific stretch of water, earning the trust of shipmasters who deferred completely to his judgment. For Laro, the safety of the vessel and the bridge was a sacred duty, a professional calling that he approached with gravity and pride. As the morning light slowly crept in through an overcast sky and a slight fog, Laro assessed the weather report. Visibility was 2 to 3 miles, far from perfect, but manageable for a man of his experience. He was confident, yet cautious, ordering the ship's engines to full ahead as they moved through the Mullet Key Channel. He was a pilot doing his job, unaware that within 90 minutes his name would be synonymous with a tragedy that would consume his life. Not through malice, but through a collision of circumstances that no amount of experience could fully prepare him for. At 7:21 a.m., John Laro had just taken the helm from his trainee, Bruce Atkins, as the massive 609-foot bulk carrier neared the critical juncture of Kutta Channel. At this moment, the world still seemed manageable. Visibility, though not perfect, was estimated at several miles. Laro had been diligent. He had monitored weather reports and communicated with other vessels in the vicinity, receiving no indications of a severe weather threat. But the sea is a fickle mistress, and in the heart of the Gulf, nature was brewing a phenomenon that no radar of that era could truly grasp. Unbeknownst to the crew of the Summit Venture, they were about to sail directly into a microburst, a localized, violent atmospheric explosion where air is driven downward with the force of a hammer. As the ship approached the 18-degree turn required to align with the bridge's high span, the heavens literally opened. It wasn't just rain. It was a deluge so dense, so opaque, that it functioned as a physical wall. Within seconds, the wind speed accelerated to hurricane force, screaming across the decks and whipping the bay into a frenzy of white foam. Crucially, the rain was so intense that it rendered the ship's radar ineffective. The digital eyes of the ship were blinded by the sheer volume of water in the air. John Laro, a man who prided himself on precision, suddenly found himself commanding 33,000 tons of moving steel in a total sensory void. Imagine the atmosphere on the bridge of the ship. The deafening roar of wind, the frantic shouting of orders, and the desperate peering through windows that offered nothing but a swirling gray abyss. Laro, realizing the gravity of the situation, ordered lookouts to the front of the vessel. Their mission was simple but impossible. Find the marker buoys. In the 400-foot-wide channel, buoys 1A and 2A were the only breadcrumbs leading to safety. Without them, the Summit venture was a blind giant. The lookouts strained their eyes against the stinging rain, but the buoys had vanished into the mist. Driven by a combination of professional instinct and the crushing momentum of the vessel, Laro made a fateful calculation. He believed a fleeting glimpse of a buoy suggested he was on course. He ordered the turn. He believed he was threading the needle through the center span. But the microburst had already pushed the Titan off its path. At 7:31 a.m., the gray veil began to lift, but it didn't reveal the open water Laro expected. Instead, it revealed a nightmare. Just one ship's length away, less than 600 feet, the massive concrete columns of the Sunshine Skyway loomed out of the fog like the headstones of a giant's grave. Full astern, Laro's voice echoed through the bridge, a desperate command for the engines to reverse at maximum power. "Hard to port! Let go the anchors!" But the port anchor hit the water, its heavy chain screaming as it dragged through the shallow floor of the bay, attempting to claw back the ship from its destiny. But physics is indifferent to human desperation. 30,000 tons of steel moving at nearly 10 knots cannot be stopped in a few hundred feet. At 7:33 a.m., the Summit venture struck Pier 2S, a critical concrete support for the southbound span, with the kinetic energy of a falling skyscraper. The horrific impact from the tens of thousands of tons of steel caused a 1,297-foot, 395-meter section of the southbound lane to collapse almost instantly, sending multiple vehicles plunging straight into the murky waters below. In that moment of chaos, pilot John Laro made a desperate emergency call to the Coast Guard, his voice breaking with horror. "Get all emergency equipment out to the Skyway immediately. A ship has just hit the Skyway Bridge. The Skyway Bridge is down. This is a Mayday emergency. Stop all traffic going onto the Skyway Bridge." Yet, amidst the blinding storm, the order to stop traffic couldn't be transmitted instantly. And high above, drivers continued unknowingly toward their deaths. One lucky driver traveling slowly in the southbound lane sensed something was wrong when the vehicles ahead of him suddenly vanished. He watched in horror as the red aircraft warning lights atop the bridge abruptly dropped and disappeared into the abyss. Moments later, the entire steel superstructure began to heave and lurch, like a thin ribbon before vanishing into the void. In a desperate attempt to halt the tragedy, this driver frantically reversed back down the incline, rolling down his windows to wave and scream warnings at the traffic behind him. Despite his efforts, 3 cars and a Greyhound bus swept past him. They plunged blindly over the broken edge of the bridge, falling 150 feet, a drop equivalent to a 14-story building. The NTSB later noted that the impact upon hitting the water was as fatal as colliding with solid ground. Amidst that fragile line, another breathtaking miracle occurred when the driver of the last vehicle to approach the broken section of the bridge managed to slam on the brakes just in time. In a state of utter panic, as he looked down into the gaping abyss right before the nose of his car, the man opened the door and abandoned the vehicle, which sat perilously balanced right at the edge of the precipice, to run back towards safety. Among the vehicles that fell during the initial collapse was a pickup truck driven by 56-year-old Wesley McIntyre. As his truck tumbled through the air, McIntyre reflexively slammed on his brakes, a futile human gesture in the face of a vertical fall. His truck struck the hull of the Summit Venture before sinking into the water. This collision with the ship, ironically, likely saved his life by breaking the terminal velocity of his fall. Inside the sinking cab, 40 feet below the surface, McIntyre fought for his life. He managed to force his way out of the submerged tomb and swim to the surface, gasping for air amidst the wreckage. He was pulled from the water by the very crew of the ship that had caused the disaster. He was the only one. The other 35 victims, men, women, and students, did not emerge. For them, the battle for survival was over in a heartbeat. As the morning light finally stabilized, it revealed a scene that would haunt Florida for generations. A gaping, jagged hole in the sky where a bridge once stood, and the Summit Venture huddled beneath the remaining span, its bow mangled by the impact. The aftermath was a descent into a silent, submerged graveyard. When the divers arrived, they didn't find a rescue mission. They found a series of underwater tableaus of grief. They found the Greyhound bus sitting upright on the silty bottom of the bay, a haunting vessel of lost dreams. They moved through zero-visibility water, feeling the twisted remains of vehicles and the cold reality of lives cut short by a microburst and a lack of bridge protection. The battle for survival had transitioned into a grim recovery as 35 souls were reclaimed from the depths. This was the moment the statistics of maritime engineering became the stories of human tragedy. When the dust of the collapse finally settled and the waters of Tampa Bay grew still, the search for answers began with a ferocity born of collective trauma. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Coast Guard immediately placed harbor pilot John Laro in their crosshairs. The initial findings were brutal, stating that his decision to proceed after losing visual and radar references was not reasonable or prudent. To the public, Laro was the villain of the story, the man who had erased 35 lives. However, as the investigation delved deeper, a more complex failure emerged. The National Weather Service had failed to forecast the violent microburst, and the bridge itself was revealed to be a giant with glass ankles, lacking any significant pier protection. While the NTSB eventually cleared Laro of negligence, acknowledging he had acted reasonably given the impossible circumstances, the verdict of the world mattered little to the man himself. For John Laro, the legal exoneration provided no sanctuary. He had already been sentenced by his own conscience to a lifetime of grief. Following the disaster, John Laro fell into a profound, dark depression. He never once attempted to hide behind legal technicalities or shift the blame to the storm. Instead, he was haunted by the faces of those who had vanished into the gray mist. He famously said in an interview, "I carry those 35 souls on my shoulders every single day." This was not a man seeking to move on. This was a man seeking a way to pay a debt that could never be settled. Driven by a desperate need for atonement, Lero began a silent, agonizing pilgrimage. He yearned to look the families of the victims in the eye and beg for a forgiveness he felt he didn't deserve. This journey of apology was fraught with obstacles. At the time, his lawyers and insurance companies fiercely blocked his attempts to contact the victims' families, fearing that any admission of remorse would be used as a weapon in the ongoing civil lawsuits. But Lero's spirit could not be silenced by legal paperwork. Despite the warnings, he sought ways to reach out, driven by a raw human necessity to acknowledge the pain he had caused. While not every family was ready to open their doors to the man they held responsible, some meetings did take place. Encounters filled with heavy silences and bitter tears. In those quiet rooms, some family members looked into Lero's eyes and saw not a negligent criminal, but a man whose soul was more shattered than the bridge itself. In those rare moments of shared humanity, some chose the path of grace and offered him their forgiveness. As his health began to fail due to the rapid progression of multiple sclerosis, Lero found himself physically unable to continue his personal visits. Yet his quest for redemption continued through letters and public statements. He spent his final years teaching young mariners at the State University of New York's Maritime College, using his own tragedy as a living textbook. He didn't just teach them about tides and charts. He taught them about the devastating weight of a single mistake. Looking into the eyes of his young cadets, he would often say with haunting gravity, "If you misjudge, you've got hell to pay." He wanted those words to be the ultimate anchor for their careers, ensuring that while he lived in his own personal hell, they might never have to experience it themselves. John Lero's legacy is a reminder that in the wake of maritime failure, official findings may offer justice, but only the grueling, honest journey of the heart can ever hope to offer peace. In the wake of the ruins, the people of Tampa Bay were left with a jagged scar across their horizon. The western span lay in tangled debris, while the undamaged eastern span was forced into an awkward, two-way configuration to keep the region's economy alive. And from the ashes of 1980, a new vision of safety was born. In April 1987, the new Sunshine Skyway opened, a concrete box girder cable-stayed masterpiece. It was a structure of grace and strength, soaring 180 feet above the water, with a main span widened to 1,200 feet to allow the giants of the sea safe passage. But its true soul lay beneath the waterline. 36 massive protective islands, known as dolphins, now surround the piers. These are not mere fenders. They are sentinels designed to sacrifice themselves, absorbing the inertia of any vessel that dares to stray off course. The new bridge isn't just a path, it is a fortress for the innocent. As for the old bridge, it underwent a meticulous, somber demolition, ensuring the shipping channel remained clear. However, history was not entirely erased. 2 miles of the original approaches were spared, repurposed into the world-famous Skyway fishing piers. Today, families cast their lines where commuters once held their breath, turning a site of tragedy into a place of quiet reflection and recreation. And what of the summit venture? The ghost ship of Tampa Bay sailed on under many names: Sailor, K.S. Harmony, and finally Jian Mao 9. In 2010, the vessel finally met its end, sinking for unknown reasons in the South China Sea, off the coast of Vietnam. It vanished into the depths, miles away from the bridge it had shattered, leaving only the echoes of that May morning behind. In May 2015, 35 years after the screaming winds and the falling steel, a granite memorial was finally dedicated at the north end of the bridge. It stands just 200 feet from the memorial of the cutter Blackthorn, bearing a bronze plaque with the names of the 35 souls who never made it home. This isn't just stone and metal. It is a sacred promise to remember. As we look at the golden cables of the new Skyway, reflecting the Florida sun, we are reminded that every innovation in safety is written in the ink of tragedy. We honor the victims, not just by mourning, but by ensuring that when the storms come again, the road will hold, the piers will stand, and no driver will ever have to face the void again. The Sunshine Skyway is no longer a monument to a fall. It is a testament to our resolve to rise, to protect, and to never forget. But the most haunting proof of the Skyway's legacy appeared 44 years later, in the early hours of March 26, 2024 Eve. In Baltimore, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, a steel truss giant with a design terrifyingly similar to the old Skyway, was struck by the container ship Dolly. As the world watched the bridge vanish into the Patapsco River, the echoes of 1980 were undeniable. Once again, a non-redundant structure had failed instantly. But this time, there was a difference. Because of the lessons carved into the granite of the Skyway Memorial, the protocol of stopping the traffic was understood as a life or death necessity. In those final 90 seconds, police were able to close the span, saving countless families from driving into the void. The 35 souls lost in Tampa Bay had, in a sense, stood guard over Baltimore 4 decades later. My dear friends, before I conclude today's message, thank you for walking this haunting journey with me. From the 1,297-foot span that vanished in 1980 to the 35 souls whose stories still whisper through the Florida breeze, we are reminded that safety is a constant battle against the unpredictable. If you have your own memories or stories about this maritime tragedy, or if you feel the weight of these lessons as I do, please share them with us in the comments below. Your voice keeps this history alive. If this journey moved you, I invite you to like, share, and follow for our future explorations into the mysteries of the deep. Your support allows us to continue honoring the past while looking toward the horizon. Thank you for your time, your heart, and your presence. I look forward to seeing you all again in our next video on the channel. Take care and stay vigilant.